Good morning, Holy Comforter. I'm Bobby Pace, and I want to thank you and welcome you to our second part of our three-part series on resurrection. So this is week 2, and last week there was some technical difficulties with my internet connection, and so I have decided that to spare you all from the same problems today, that I'm going to record it and we'll present the presentation. Abby's been very kind to to play it. So I will be here and will be available and watch along with you and answer questions or respond to comments that you might have after the presentation is over. So this won't be interactive per se, but I will be on the chat function and you are able to utilize that chat function, or at the end, obviously, I'm going to be around to take some questions. So today's discussion is really going to be on the Abrahamic traditions. And I want to review a little bit from where we left off last time. So we left off with this idea of resurrection narratives. And if you recall, I created what I'm labeling sort of a working definition here of resurrection narratives being a written or verbal account of a death followed by a divinely orchestrated return to a purposeful and conscious life. I think that's really important for us to kind of keep in mind. Um, we're not talking just about the idea of someone coming back from the dead, but we're also thinking about, or coming back to life, right? But we're thinking about how the return to life, what that means. And there needs to be some consciousness or at least lesson as part of these narratives. So, like, there's got to be some lesson out of it that we learn and we read about and that we can kind of explore and understand. And so the first week, we looked at early Greek myths and a little bit some Egyptian myths as well. So we have the lesson from Osiris, which is basically that our restoration to life will likely not make us whole or identical to the life we once had. We also have our lessons from Persephone, which is that death is to be mourned and life is to be celebrated, despite the fact that both are out of our control, and that ultimately the seasons of both are natural. If you remember, Persephone is sort of the Greek understanding or story as to how the seasons come to be. And then we have the lessons from Alcestis, which is, though you may willingly yield yourself to death, death could be overpowered and overcome. And even though you attempt to sacrifice yourself, um, in this instance for her husband's life, um, the act itself, the generosity of the act may be seen as worthy of redemption and redeeming you. And so those are kind of the narratives that we're looking at from the first week. And I asked each of you last week to think about this in terms of, how we are coming back out and how we are being resurrected from the COVID-19 pandemic. We are really seeing the opening up, right? The re-beginning of life, acknowledging that it's not like it was. It's very different. And in fact, there's a new trend going around social media right now that I kind of love and I kind of um, followed. And it's show us the last picture before COVID-19, the last normal picture before COVID-19 disrupted your life. And it was very interesting because, as some of you may know, I'm a college professor at a community college, and a dean there. And I take students to New York for the Model United Nations every year. And my sort of last normal picture was all of us on our bridge as a team photo, as a group photo. So excited about going to New York, so excited about participating with 6,000 other college students from across the country. And of course, that could not happen, right? Just a few days thereafter, the conference was canceled. New York, of course, turned in to an epicenter of the disease with more deaths than any other country besides the U.S. has actually had any single country. And I'm reminded of how much of a former life is really in that photo from 2 months ago. And so as you're hearing these narratives, as you're thinking about them, I really want you to conceptualize and contextualize these in the concept of your own today, in your own reality. Because I think there's so many amazing lessons that we can learn. So, the plan for today, um, we are going to explore the biblical accounts of resurrection in both the Hebrew and the Christian Bibles. We are going to ask what each of the resurrection narratives have to teach us, because I come from this tradition, and maybe it's just my academic and scholarship background, but I think there are lessons to be learned in everything. And we're going to kind of compare those to the lessons that we learned last week, and then we're going to start thinking about the modern applications, which is what we're going to cover next Sunday in our final part of this discussion. So I want to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork here. Again, I love caveats. So when we talk about sort of who rose from the dead in the Jewish and Christian traditions, and like who are we going to be looking for at and exploring, I'm only going to give you four, so don't worry. It's not going to be too arduous. Just four of them, and ultimately, I decided that for this talk, we can really account for for Jesus's resurrection. I mean, this is the Easter season, right? This is what we celebrate in terms of the salvation, um, individual and personal salvations, but then also, of course, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we typically can all refer to Lazarus, right? That's kind of a household name. Um, and those two who Jesus raised from the dead, not the only person Jesus raised from the dead, but one of, and arguably the most famous. Um, and these are so essential. But I also think these are very familiar to us, particularly in the readings that we have throughout the season of Lent and then the Easter season and moving forward. So I'm going to be really just looking at the historical accounts of resurrection here. And I'm not going to include um, accounts of you know, Jesus and of Lazarus and of the miracles that Jesus performed, because I think those are the things that um, we already understand. And so instead, I'm going to look at the other, or at least four other versions of resurrection and what we can learn from those. And I'm only going to be looking at historical accounts of resurrection. So I'm not going to include ones that were in dreams or in visions. Those also make their way in the Bible, but I'm leaving those out. And I'm also not talking about the idea of the last judgment. And so, I'm not talking about things in the future. I'm not talking about things that perhaps, that come from revelation, that may have been dreams or ideas or visions of what is to come. And I'm only looking at resurrection narratives facilitated by mere mortals. So those are the ones closest to us. Like that's at least the closest that I am. Certainly, I don't profess to be anything greater uh, greater than I am, and some days not so great. So what I really want to do is look at notions of resurrections in our tradition, right? Both the Christian and Jewish tradition that normal folks have worked on. So I'm going to turn the camera off now. I'll kind of go back and forth, but I'm going to turn the camera off right now just so that you can get into the art, because I do have pictures here, and I'm all about sort of the images of these notions of resurrection because I think they help to capture the essence of what's going on. And I'm going to read you the biblical passages. They're pretty short. And so I'm going to read and then kind of explain and draw out some of those messages. So when we look at the Hebrew Bible accounts of resurrection, again, I'm only looking at two, and I'm referring to the Jewish Publication Society, the JPS edition of the Tanakh, or the Jewish Hebrew Bible. Okay, so let's begin. Um, and this is the raising of the first son. And I have to say, you know what? I'm going to put my camera back on now. I said I wasn't going to do it, but I'm going to do it because I love this point. I think there's something so mystical and magical and wonderful about all this is we have two stories of resurrections of sons in the Hebrew text. And I just think it's so fascinating that we have these two sons. And then, of course, we have Jesus as the resurrection of the third son, and the concept of the Trinity and just all of that. It's just really, really, really powerful and interesting and curiosity inspiring for me, at least. And so I want to talk a little bit and read a little bit about Elijah and the son of the widow of Zarephath. And this is in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 to 24. Okay, so um, after a while, the son of the mistress of the house fell sick, and his illness grew worse until he had no breath left in him. She said to Elijah, "What harm have I done you, O man of God, that you should come here to recall my sin and cause the death of my son?" I think this one is really, I don't know why I'm just don't want you staring at me while I'm reading. Um, even though that's what's happening. I think this is a really important point. So what you have is a widow woman and her son, and Elijah has been staying at their house, and they have been showing him tremendous hospitality. And in fact, there's some stories about food and jars, and I'm not going to get into that. But essentially, the widow is saying, are my sins what's caused my son to die? And you see this image here on the screen of the death of the son. Um, and Elijah says, "Give me the boy." And taking him from her arms, he carried him to the upper chamber where he was staying and laid him down on his own bed. I think this metaphor of upperness, and the idea of, in every instance that we're going to read, the person's up. They're going up. I don't know that that's necessarily a metaphor to the heavens or not, but they're going up. And in this instance, um, he cried to the Lord. So this is Elijah. And he says, "O Lord my God, will you bring calamity upon this widow whose guest I am and let her son die?" What a fascinating line, right? Where he's actually questioning God and saying, like, are you really going to let this woman's son die when I'm a guest here and they have been so hospitable and kind to me? Then he stretched out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, saying, "O Lord my God, let this child's life return to this body. I think this is important. In this instance, he is not saying, please, God, please, I humbly beseech you, right? Please have forgiveness. Lift this child up. He's actually making demands of God. He's saying, like, make this kid come back to life again. Like, make this kid well. And the Lord heard Elijah's plea, and the child's life returned to his body, and he revived. And Elijah picked up the child, brought him down from the upper room into the main room, and gave him to his mother. See, said Elijah, your son is alive. And the woman answered Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is truly in your mouth. So we hear this idea of man of God, very, very similar to what we will hear with Jesus as son of God, right? But clearly, this is a mortal. Elijah is not divine. He is a man of God. He is not God. He is not of an essence of God. And it's really interesting at this time when you see an image like you have on your screen with Elijah leaning over the boy. And it's going to be much more graphic in the next example. But what you see is this belief that literally you would envelop the entire child. The healer would envelop them, wrap themselves around them, and essentially breathe life back into the child, like you would give of your essence. And you can begin to see that here, where Elijah is really, really trying to take his life force and put it into the son. So what are some lessons that we can learn? Well, one, it's about hospitality, right? And there's this notion that you can question God, you can make demands of God. It's okay not to be a saint and to still be godly. In the next case, that's very true that we are not dealing with a saint here. Um, the second one is the raising of the second son. And this is Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha, and the Shunammite woman's son. And this is in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 32 to 37. And I want to sort of set the context here. This woman was very well. Two things. One, who is Elisha and how is he different from Elijah? Well, Elisha was Elijah's disciple and student, and so he ultimately was a follower of Elijah, and he became really detached when Elijah um, leaves this world. I'm trying to be a little vague here because there are different traditions as to whether or not Elijah actually died, if he descended into heaven, or ascended into heaven, or like, or if he's still just roaming the earth. So let's just say he left the space as we know it. That's probably the best way to think about it. And Elisha took real offense to that. He became very detached, emotionally detached, kind of bitter and angry, actually, like profoundly bitter and angry. Um, there's this famous story. You can't quite, well, I guess you can kind of tell on him. He's bald. I know. No, that's not why I like the story. He's bald, and there's this famous instance in which he ultimately is being ridiculed by this group of 42 kids. Like they're making fun of him as kids do, um, because he's bald, and they're teasing him, right? And so he decides to pray to God, to ultimately curse them and have a wild bear come out and kill all of them. Well, wild bears, a pack of bears, come out and kill all 42 children, which they do. So, like, this guy, hasn't always been the nicest person in the world, right? He's responsible for these kids' deaths. And he has been staying at this woman's house. She actually built an addition onto her home, so she was obviously wealthy, but a place for him to stay. And he is like, he's with her, he's a part of this process. Um, and and then, ironically, um, the woman's son dies, and ultimately, she goes out to seek him, right? And so, I'm actually going to read a little bit further, a little bit longer. So, she went on until she came to the man of God on Mount Carmel. So this is Elijah. When the man of God saw her from afar, he said to his servant Gehazi, "There is the Shunammite woman. Go, hurry toward her and ask her, 'How are you? How is your husband? How is the child?'" So this is the woman who's been sort of sponsoring and taking care of him. And he is not willing to go there himself. He actually sends his servant to go talk with her. I mean, this is a very odd kind of concept here, right? And she says, "We are well." But when she came up to the man of God on the mountain, so she says it to the servant, "Oh, everything's fine." But as she walks up to Elisha, she clasps his feet, and Gehazi steps forward to push her away, but the man of God says, "Let her alone, for she's in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me, and he has not told me." Then she said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Didn't I say, 'Don't mislead me'?" This is another one of those um, really famous, kind of miraculous births, not Mareka's conception, but she was barren and then she had a child. So that was the miracle. He said to Gehazi, "Tie up your skirts, take my staff in your hand, and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. And if anyone greets you, do not answer him. And place my staff on the face of the boy." So he's actually telling his servant, "You go do this. I don't have time. I am not going to go save this boy's life. But here's my staff. You go out there and you put this on him, and maybe he'll come back from the dead." And the boy's mother says, "As the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." That, my friends, if you aren't aware, that is exactly the wording that Elisha told Elijah when Elijah was to descend and to disappear. So this struck him, and it kind of like wrestled him out of his detachment. And he rose up and he followed her. He said, "Fine, he'll go along." So Gehazi had gone before them, had placed the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. He turned back to meet him and told him that the boy has not awakened. Elijah came into the house, and there was the boy laid out dead on his couch. He went in, shut the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he mounted the bed and placed himself over the child. So this is that idea of like kind of encapsulating him, right? He put his mouth on its mouth, his eyes on its eyes, and his hand on its hands as he bent over it, and the body of the child became warm. He stepped down, walked once up and down the room, then mounted and bent over him. Thereupon the boy sneezed several times, and the boy opened his eyes. Elijah called Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite woman," he said. And he called her. When she came to him, he said, "Pick up your son." She came and fell at his feet and bowed low to the ground. Then she picked up her son and left. So pretty amazing kind of instance here. And so we think, okay, what lessons can we learn from this? Well, there's a notion of radical empathy here, right? The empathy was not on Elisha, it was on the woman. It was on the Shunammite woman, right? She was empathetic. She was the one who had helped him, who had been compassionate towards him. And ultimately, this radical empathy, we can they can lead to miracles. We can each learn to find empathy that we may have lost in our lives. I think that's really, really powerful thing. So now we're going to switch to two Christian accounts, and I'll be relatively quick with these. And these Christian accounts of the resurrection, I'm going by the New Revised Standard Version. And I'm going to be looking at the resurrection of Tabitha. And this is Peter resurrects Tabitha. And if you've never been to St. Peter's, this is one of the chapels in St. Peter's, and this is a beautiful mural that's on the wall. But this is coming from Acts 9, chapter 9, verses 32 to 42. Now, as Peter went here and there among all the believers, he came down also to the saints living in Lydda. There he found a man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden for 8 years, for he was paralyzed. Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed. And immediately he got up, and all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Again, the upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, please come to us without delay. So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made. So this is Tabitha, had made while she was with them. So her generosity was there, right? Her charity. Peter put all of them outside and they knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, Tabitha, get up. And she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then, calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. So, in this instance, we're really thinking about the fact that good works, charity, those things are rewarded. She was gone. And in this instance, we don't hear anything about a family, right? She could have been a person who lived alone. What we do know is that she showed kindness and generosity to those around her, and that for that reason, Peter responded and raised her from the dead. Now, the last story is really my favorite because as a teacher, I've been here. And you might be thinking that right now too. This is the resurrection of Tychos, and I'm probably butchering that name. He's resurrected by Paul. So we have Peter and Paul. And this is from Acts 20, 7-12. So Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12. And this is actually, as you can see in the picture, this is a pretty interesting story. On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them. Since he intended to leave the next day, he continued speaking until midnight. There were many lamps in the room upstairs where they were meeting. A young man named Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and bending over him, took him in his arms and said, do not be alarmed, for his life is in him. Then Paul went upstairs, and after he had broken bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn, and then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive and were not a little comforted. I love this image because if we take this and we compare it to Elisha, it's very similar in that Paul has things he wants to say. And so he's just completely ignoring the folks around him and determined that he isn't going to be hospitable. He's going to tell them what they need, even though there's a poor kid who is falling asleep in a window because Paul has gone on for so long and he does not stop. He is not paying attention to the world that's happening around him. He's self-centered. He's thinking about himself and the message that he believes he needs to portray. And what's interesting is you see the same similarities. The boy falls, the boy dies, Paul goes, he hovers around him, he encapsulates him, just like we see Elijah doing. And then he says, everything is fine after the prayer, leaves the boy alive. So you have this miracle of this resurrection, and then continues to go away and live his own life, right? And continues to talk, continues to really still be self-centered. And I think this is so interesting because um, I tend to always think that I personally and think that the people of the Old Testament are so much more interesting and entertaining than the people portrayed in the New Testament. God of the New Testament, a lot better than God of the Old Testament. But the people of the Old Testament, they're just so engaging. But then you have these moments in the New Testament with people like Paul, and you can kind of say, what was this guy thinking? How self-centered could he be? Yet, yet he helps, right? And I think this is an interesting. So the lesson from this is that we have an obligation to not harm others because of our own actions and our own negligence, right? That we have to make things right. And that's where I want to leave you with um, today as we think about applying this to our lives moving forward. What can we draw from these narratives? I think there's a few things. One, we have an obligation to be mindful of more than ourselves and our own intentions and our own individual interests. By saving others, we can learn empathy and we can also improve our own lives. And then finally, charity and grace offered freely to others opens the possibility of charity and grace towards ourselves. So when you think of resurrection, as we start contemplating it for next week, I really want you to stop and think about how the COVID pandemic has caused you some resurrection in your own life. Perhaps it's resurrection of insecurities or feelings, vulnerabilities. Perhaps it's resurrection of promise, of time with family. All of those are real and all of those are valid, and all of those are experiences that we have to wrestle with as we begin in Colorado and as a church to move forward and become reborn. Thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.